And there we are live.
We are live. Alex is away this week, although he appears to be here. He can't speak for because he's listening on a prior engagement. He has another meeting. Although he's here partly so he can just start the recording and things. So I will attempt to run the meeting this week as best as I can. On the agenda, there's a bunch of stuff on the agenda you can see on the wiki page for Ehcache 3. My dogs are now going to punish me for not shutting the office door. Bear with me a few seconds.
So while Chris quickly does that, I guess the first things that we wanted to discuss were release milestones. I believe Alex sent out an email on that topic on the dev mailing list.
On the topic of what? Sorry.
Release milestone. I was just.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about that or?
No, go ahead. Take over. It's just.
Sure. So there was some discussion earlier this week about release milestones and what were sensible milestones for us to use. And what we decided upon was we wanted a set of milestones that sort of combined two aims. Firstly, we want to get as much feedback. We want to produce a product that is as useful as possible to as many people as possible, as soon as possible. One, because that's useful for the community. You get something that you can actually use and start integrating and playing with. And two, is it's useful for us because it means that we get more feedback from you, the wider community, and from users regarding what we can do to make the API better. And so with that sense, we wanted to aim for the sort of the getting a release out that combines the core feature set of what constitutes a cache, and there's a nice intersection between that and 107, the API. So the first release milestone is the idea of releasing a 107 alpha. So that's a 107, an implementation or an artifact that can be 107 compliant, but is otherwise minimal in feature set. So it's heap only. It passes TCK. It contains all the features necessary or specified by 107, but nothing more. So there are no extended features, things like transactionality, XA or local, no store to disk, nothing clustered, nothing like that. The next major milestone is the idea of getting out an open source beta. So this would be a beta release of the full open source jar, the full open source library. So that would mean that it supports all the features of the OSS line. So that's storage on heap, storage on disk, storage to both tiers, transactions, cache, well, everything in 107 plus everything else. Now, some of those things are some of those things, such as Bootstrap cache loaders, we're going to pull outside of the main repository and they become external modules, but the anticipation is that we will ship those with the beta.
Chris, I don't know if that's the same for Hung, but you're breaking up pretty badly for me.
Ooh, that is not good.
Nope.
It's okay for me.
Okay, then it's on my side. Go ahead.
Okay, fingers crossed that this doesn't sound like junk. Basically, you can see all this if you go to look at the agenda. There's a link to the milestones. From that link, you can go look at all the issues that are tagged as being necessary for the 107 alpha and for the OSS beta. And I suspect it's not an exhaustive list at the moment, particularly for the OSS beta. There are tentative due dates for getting those things working, but nothing's set in stone yet. The intention is to get that stuff out as soon as possible, but obviously not sooner. So that's it regarding milestones. I think it's a plan that makes sense, and I think it's a plan that suits both developer and user purposes. SPI testing-wise, Hung did some work in the last week or so getting a framework in place to be able to do SPI testing. So that's testing of internal SPIs that will be implemented by the various modules. The first SPI we have as a candidate for using this framework is the store SPI. The idea being that we have a set of standardized tests that all store implementations will be able to pass. So heap, disk, etc., etc. The plan is to go ahead and start writing that SPI test suite as soon as possible. There's a pull request out at the moment for the SPI testing framework to get that back in to master. I put a few comments on that, and I'm just going to work on that, and we'll get that in as soon as we can. Obviously, there may be some tweaks to happen to that once we get moving on getting it implemented. There's going to be Aurelian Bosniowski, who's one of the QA resources or QA engineers at Terracotta, is going to be working on the authoring a set of SPI tests for the store, which means it's nice we get an independent author of those tests who hasn't been involved in developing the store interface tool. That's more of a point of process or anything. Things are moving on that front. Hopefully, once the framework's in place and we're happy with it and the first set of tests is run, this process will become faster and more streamlined. And once more people are used to writing these SPI tests, things will become better on that front.
Do you think it's important to support before and after in the SPI testing framework?
I'm gonna say no for the moment, at least until we need it. Before and after can be done inside the unit. So from my point of view, I don't like before and after as a testing style anyway, because I don't like sharing state between different test methods. And at the end of the day, you can always to me, it's ideally all state should be internalized within the test method, no instance state at all. So I would avoid it unless we get a point where we really can't avoid it.
Cool.
So for the moment, I think you're fine not having it.
Yeah, and I think it's indeed something that can be added if needed or on demand, kind of.
Yeah. I mean, we're not. I mean, these. The way these tests at least should be written is a pretty strict manner. So you come out with pretty strict unit tests or unit style tests, at least BDD tests, I guess they are, which explicitly test a very precise aspect of a behavior. So they usually, assuming that the module they're testing against is reasonably easy to set up, and does not require a large amount of mocking of dependencies and stuff, they should be pretty simple tests. And if we start finding they're not, it probably says something about the dependency set of the thing we're trying to test and the way that the code's been factored.
I think it makes sense just to wait to see if we need that.
Yeah. There's a million features we could throw in if we wanted that
yeah, but we don't want to reinvent a complete testing framework either. So
I mean, yeah, the other thing is if we found ourselves pushing for things like before and after, I would hesitate to not. At that point, I would start thinking I don't want to start reinventing and re-implementing all of the features of, say, JUnit or TestNG, but start thinking about whether there are better ways of hooking into JUnit / TestNG / whatever test framework and utilizing its.
Yeah, that's what I thought too, because there is definitely a way to hook into a JUnit framework and reuse it internally without exposing it.
And then, cool. So anyway, let's leave all that stuff until we know for certain that we need it or that we don't, and fingers crossed we never will. Cool. The main thing that's up for discussion that I wanted to talk about, and Alex wanted us to talk about this week, is the third item on the agenda, and the final, unless anyone has any other business. It's talking about the discussion that we started earlier this week, and Alex and I think, are in agreement about what we think we want, but it'd be good to socialize it with a wider group and air it to the community in general and see if anyone has any opinions. regarding cache loaders and cache writers. And I'll start talking about cache loaders and cache writers, but there is a natural extension of what we're talking about to a wider set of, or to a wider concept, more general concept. So Alex started looking at cache loaders and cache writers and how you would configure them particularly in a managed sense, in a standalone sense, and how they would be lifecycled. And he started talking about having a factory of cache loaders or a factory of cache writers. And then he started thinking about what gets passed to that factory. And I'm going to try and walk you down from as best as I can recall the thought process that we went through, so that if you have a disagreement with the thought process we went through, you can raise it at any point so that you can understand how we got to where we got to. Because if I take you straight to where we got to, it may not make sense, and then we might end up having to go backwards through the thought process. Hopefully Alex isn't cursing or doesn't get angry because I misrepresent what we said. It's not intentional if I do.
You said you would do it on purpose so that you would need to join, so...
Good point. Okay. This is all in... Yes, totally. So we'll see if we can end up something completely abhorrent at the end of this. So we started talking about a factory of cache loaders and cache writers, which will be familiar to anyone that's looked at... Some of 107 uses this pattern, this idea of a sort of a factory where you hold temporarily... Anthony can't decide if he wants to be here or not. Where you hold temporarily things like config and stuff, and you delegate the construction of the cache loader cache writer to that, and that at some point the factory is called and you create the cache loader cache writer and then it's consumed. And so Alex started talking about this from thinking, well, what state? First of all, if you have a factory interface, what does it look like, and what gets passed to the create method in order for the factory implementation that the user implements, so that factory can make a decision about the nature of the thing that it generates. And Alex's first thought, I think, and what actually seems like a sensible first thought is, well, the obvious thing to pass is a cache. I want a cache loader for this cache. I want a cache writer for this cache. And then you have the question of, well, what is the cache loader factory or the user's factory implementation going to do with that cache? And the obvious thing is it's going to want to know something. It's not going to, I mean, the most obvious thing for that factory to do, particularly when you think about a cache loader or a cache writer, is you're talking about, with cache loaders and cache writers, you're talking about, in the first case, about where the data, the thing that sources the data to populate the cache. And in the second case, you're talking about some kind of system of record or some higher in the sense of importance storage location for the data that backs the cache. Usually these things, quite often these things are going to be coupled. And in that situation, the thing that's most important about the cache that the factory wants to know when it's asked to construct for a cache is, what's the identity of the cache? Because the identity is effectively the way of the cache loader factory from knowing what is the cache being used to cache.
And what kind of loader / writer do you need to?
Yeah. So if this is the cache of people, then the cache loader needs to connect to the people database to make sure that it loads data from the people database to populate the thing properly. And it needs to know what kind of values it needs to associate and so on and so forth. So from there you start saying, well, then we start talking about the concept of the identity of a cache. Now the problem is at this point is, this goes back into a long time.
And even before talking about the identity, we raised the point, I remember IRC discussions on that, we raised the point about what state is the cache in.
Yes.
When you potentially pass into the factory. Is it fully initialized? Because as soon as it goes out in user code, who knows what happens? Or is it in a different state? And if it's in a different state, what's the
state is it in?
Yeah, what state is it in? And what are the issues / solutions to make sure it doesn't get misused?
Now, yeah, and in my head, it's pretty clear, at least to me, that it can't be fully initialized because the cache loader or cache writer is a dependency of the cache. So if there is no cache loader or cache writer, it's not fully initialized. It doesn't have all its dependencies yet. If you were to interact with the cache at that point, it wouldn't behave like its final state would behave because there would be no cache loader to talk to. So to me, it's pretty clear it's not in a final state. Regarding what state it could be in, we dig into that, but it's going to become moot. Alex and I believe it becomes moot.
And I guess then it's at that point that then we started the discussion on cache identity, because as soon as you say it's not fully initialized, the next logical step is to say then we don't pass it.
Yes.
But then what do we pass?
Well, the other thing is, of course, is we talked about this when we first started. This is when the sort of the module framework I don't know how much of this is recorded, but I don't think I'm mentioning anything super secret here. The module framework that the Ehcache 3.0 is based on started out life as an internal project within Terracotta to define a module framework for a different kind of product. Now, it's not important what that product was, but it had a similar concept of thing and thing that manages the thing. So foo and foo manager. And one of the things we wanted to be very clear on was that, and one of the things we wanted to avoid, and I think it is a sensible thing to avoid, is we wanted to avoid back references from foos to foo managers. Likewise, from caches to cache managers. Cache managers manage caches, but the cache should be ignorant of what's managing it. And then we had this concept. Well, how does the cache manager reference its caches? Well, it has an alias. And it's really the alias that encapsulates the identity of the cache. It's the alias that the user application will retrieve the cache with. So when you've got your people cache, you go to your central cache manager and you say, give me the cache with alias people. And that gives you a cache and you use it.
Yeah. And so identity is actually the combination of the manager's identity and the cache alias.
Yes, and you've got this idea of like of a nested of a tuple, a coordinate, if you like.
Yeah.
The name of the cache manager, or the Java object identity of the cache manager, or the config that it's configured from, whichever way you want to think about it, and then the alias of the cache within that cache manager. But the point being that caches do not have a concept of alias. They don't know what alias they're referred to by, and that's also obvious when you think about the fact that we're supporting the concept of a standalone cache. It doesn't have an alias. It doesn't have a manager, so it can't have an alias. It's just, and its only concept of identity at that point is its Java object identity. It is that cache. You have a reference to the object. That's
the reference you hold to it.
Yeah. Potentially, if it was generated for persistence, then you might know where the data is persisted. That's a bigger, wider concept of identity, but that's a separate thing in and of itself. So you get to this point, but hang on, we don't want the caches to know their own identities. But if the caches don't know their identities, then there's no point in passing the cache, and if to the factories, because there's no way they can tell what the cache is or does without being able to, I don't know, do something weird like say to the cache manager, what's the alias of this cache that I've got here, which is a bit backwards. And like Louis pointed out, you also have all the problems with life cycling. If you pass the cache, what state is the cache in? How does it behave? What happens if the factory tries to interact with the cache? Which bits of it make sense? Which bits of it? Horrible dependency mess. Don't think about it. You get in this horrible. You don't want to put yourself in a position where a cache loader can sensibly try and interact with something that it is directly a dependency of. You effectively have created a dependency cycle and a nightmare for yourself. So what we step back to is said, and it makes sense from a dependency point of view as well, that cache loaders. The way I like to think about this is, what is the standalone? When you're creating a standalone cache, what do you pass?
That makes sense.
Yeah, and the answer is that what seems to make sense is you pass the actual cache loader or cache writer instance to the standalone cache.
Yeah, because you only have a single cache, so why would you have anything else than a single matching?
And how that,
loader
how
or
that
writer.
Created is you could create a directory, you can do the thing, you can create an anonymous instance, however you want to create an instance of those interfaces.
You can inject it by loading an XML file over the network.
And from a dependency point of view, it makes sense. The cache is a dependency of the cache loader or cache writer is a dependency of the cache. It gets created and then handed to it at construction time. And then the cache gets to keep a nice final reference to its cache loader or cache writer, and everything's clean.
And so that happens either via the configuration file or when you use the Fluent Builder API we're aiming for.
Cool. So then the question is, so what's the purpose does this factory serve? Well, the factory then you start thinking about the factory serving the purpose in the concept of the cache manager. So the cache manager can create cache loader and cache writer instances using factories. And at that level, you are the cache manager. You do know the alias of the cache. And so at that point, you can start about thinking having if you like, having a cache loader or cache writer interface that takes two things. The cache doesn't exist yet. It hasn't been constructed because you're going to start your loaders and writers first. But what you do know is you do know the full set of config. So you can pass the config, which means that the cache loader and cache writer can do intelligent things based on the config of the cache. And the other thing the cache manager knows is it knows the alias. So you end up with a factory that is told, as a factory, you basically get told, I would like to have you to create the cache loader for the cache with this config that has this alias. And that way you get to do nice clean things like saying, I don't know, you could have a map from alias to, I don't know, JDBC URL that you use to connect to some database somewhere.
Yeah, you could have that. You could even have fine-grained stuff by inspecting the configuration and checking.
Yep.
Is that the long-lived one? Is that the short-lived one? Is that up to you in the end?
Is this cache?
Yeah, because also remember that the configuration is that extensible configuration that can hold services that you've decided to add, etc., etc. So
one of the service configurations could directly be a configuration for a cache loader that is consumed by the cache loader factory and might actually explicitly contain a bunch of encoded constructor parameters for a specific type cache loader type. We think that this approach makes sense for cache loaders and cache writers. What's more, we think that this approach makes sense for all cache-specific services. So that is anything that is a dependency, that is a service that is a dependency of a single unique cache, or uniquely of a given cache. Cache loaders and cache writers are obvious examples of that. Off the top of my head, I'm trying to think of another one. My brain is not failing. I'm a bit ill at the moment, so I'm going to claim that's an excuse for not thinking of another one. But generically, we think this is a pattern that makes sense for all cache-specific services, that you have this concept of a factory, and the factory is told, we want you to create this thing that is going to be used by a cache with this config and this alias. You assemble all the dependencies of the cache, and then those are thrown at the standalone cache. Well, at the cache builder, which is the same API that is used by a user to state their cache.
So that would mean, so the factory gets registered at the cache manager level, and then you build the caches. Do you then explicitly say at the cache level that it's a cache that should query the cache loader, cache writer factory? Or does it mean that by default it will query it, and if the factory returns nothing, whether we make that a null or a marker?
I guess it depends. There's two ways you could conceive of configuring it. You could have a single cache loader factory for the cache manager and have it feed, or there's no reason why you couldn't have multiple cache loader factories defined within the cache manager and have different caches reference different cache loader factories. I don't know, but I don't think that makes sense.
Why would we do that, though? Because it's not buying us anything.
Depends, doesn't it?
I don't know.
Well, I guess no, not necessarily.
The indirection can be done in user code.
Yes, the indirection can be done in user code. You could have a cache loader factory that multiplexes itself to multiple.
The thing I'm wondering though is that would we allow a managed cache to take directly a cache loader or a cache? Let's say I'm using the Fluent API to build. So I've got my cache manager, and I use the Fluent API to build a cache, to add a cache to it. Can I just pass? Do we foresee that I can just pass in?
I don't see why a cache loader instance. I don't see why not. I mean, so to me, the big thing to come out of this is that the most important thing that comes out of this is that the standalone cache builder takes an instance of a cache loader and an instance of a cache writer when you're configuring cache loaders and cache writers. Quite exactly how we choose to do now, I think we will use factories at the cache manager level to construct them, but that's not necessarily true, and there are a variety of different ways you can configure the factories, even if it is true. What I think is important is that it's that we do it that way. That the standalone, if a standalone cache has dependencies, it's not responsible. It's basically the same idea as before. Is if you choose to be a standalone cache, for which I think in my head synonym unmanaged cache. The fact that it says it's unmanaged implies the user must do all the management, which means the user is responsible for lifecycling all the dependencies of that cache.
Yes.
So that means if your cache uses some kind of underlying persistence mechanism that uses files, you create this persistence servicey thing and you inject it. And when the cache is shut down, you destroy it. The same is true of cache loaders and cache writers.
Yeah, and so it makes sense that once you use a managed cache, we request you go through a factory for that, because we don't want you to suddenly cripple the system by shutting down the loader or the manager at the wrong time.
I mean, there's no. There are arguments. I don't know how strong they are for allowing somebody to inject a cache loader directly, but.
What?
So it's in this thing that the cache manager has multiple responsibilities, right? It does namespacing and it acts as a repository for caches. It also handles the life cycles of the services and dependencies of the cache.
Yep.
If we expose the API in such a way that you could inject a specific cache loader for a specific cache and then attach it to a cache manager, that's fine. But at that point, you have the cache manager basically abdicates itself of the responsibility for lifecycling that cache load. It says, "Well, I didn't create it.
It could be done that way. Yeah,
I didn't create it. If I didn't create it through the factory, I'm not going to close it for you. I don't know where this thing came from. I can't, in good conscience, destroy it at any point because I don't know when it's safe."
Yeah, but so I guess then it's also a good way of saying it could be a stance, saying, yeah, that's why we do it through a factory, because you're creating a managed cache, so you're asking the framework to do some management, and that's part of the management we offer. And yeah, live by the rules. If in the end you want to do everything yourself, yeah, maybe you don't need it to be in a cache manager.
Yep. I can conceive of a situation. I mean, I don't know if this would be a good idea, but you could do it where you had a cache loader that delegated to a database, and you had two different caches in two different cache managers that both want to delegate to the same database. And because you are ridiculously zealous with your resource management, you wanted to make sure they used the common connection pool. So you could make it so that two different caches use the same cache loader, and you handled its life cycling. But I don't know if that's. I mean, it's conceivable.
I don't know. I think
it's a good idea.
I think saying that you have to go through a factory in that case, you could still make it use the same.
Yeah, you could.
connection pool. So it's. I think that's one of the reasons we actually want to put as early as possible milestones out, because we're probably going to start with a few opinionated design decisions.
Yep.
For simplicity, because
what we're talking about here is that at the moment we're saying you've got two ways you can go. You can go cache manager, fully managed everything way, and you have standalone, roll your own, you handle all the dependencies, throw everything together yourself. It's either let us do everything or you do everything. Mm-hmm. And right now, and there is middle ground. And I suspect middle ground is allowing someone to let the cache manager manage some resources and not others. I don't want to put that in just yet, because I think that it that kind of sort of lack of clarity in who's responsible for what it sounds like it's asking people to tie themselves in knots and leak resources.
I believe that middle ground is really, really large when you think about all the possible combinations of all the different options. And I think in IT, with code, you can probably solve everything within one more level of indirection.
Yeah.
So if you are really in such a use case, you can work through it. And
you can work through it. It might be you might have to write a few more layers and a bit more of a multiplexing, demultiplexing class, but it's not the end of the world. No, so yes, I think stick to those two solutions for at least until 107 alpha and probably to the OSS beta, and then see. And if people start kicking and screaming about it, it's understandable.
And
reassess.
And it's an open source project. Pull requests can be discussed on that topic also.
Yep.
But at least we'll have a starting point and a starting philosophy. So we'll have grounds on which to build these discussions and and evaluate their meaningfulness with regards to the project.
I did have a dig through Alex's fork and to see if he'd actually started prototyping. But if he has started prototyping, he hasn't pushed it to that branch to his fork yet. So I can't show you any of the stuff he's actually working on. But I know I think he's assigned the cache writer issue to himself. So, but I think what we've got makes sense, and I think it covers the two common use cases nicely, and it still supports, and you still have the ability to support a standalone cache, an unattached cache with a loader if you wish.
And I think I remember discussing that at different times, but one of the things we would like to try to live with is having one way of doing something.
Yep.
And so that's also one of the reasons.
I think that makes sense.
Sometimes the one way is different when you change environments, such as moving from a managed to an unmanaged cache.
Yep.
But
they're different things you're doing about.
Yeah, exactly. That's expected because they're different.
Yeah, and it's also still it kind of is one way, and that was why I was pushing that I want the way that the cache manager constructs its caches to be the same as the way a user constructs its caches. Yep. I want them to use the same builder. If it's a good API, it should, at least in principle, be able to serve both purposes.
Exactly.
So we have a strong reason to bifurcate.
Exactly.
There is a more TBD, which I interpret as meaning, is there any other business? Does anyone have anything they'd like
I could actually bring the item that I sent to the dev mailing list. So at one point, Hung pushed some code to GitHub and created a pull request with a command "do not merge" just for review. Mm-hmm. And the state in which that pull request was broke the build. And I realized that fundamentally we've got two levels of failures. We've got the main line of Ehcache, for which the build should never break, period. Yep. Whatever happens, it should not break. And if it breaks, we hope we can pinpoint it to environment issue and other stuff like that.
Yep.
Because no bad code should get into the main line. But pull requests, it's a different matter. And so what I did on the CloudBees setup is I split the two responsibilities in two jobs. So normally we have now the Ehcache 3 job, which is the job building from the GitHub account, and it's gonna build each time there is a push to the main GitHub account. For the moment, we have a single branch there, the master branch, but the day we have multiple branches, it should build all the branches from that single job. And so I created another job, which has the exact same configuration, so it's also a matrix job that's going to build against Java 1.6, 1.7, and 1.8 in parallel. And that job only builds pull requests.
Okay.
And so when you see failure emails in the mailing list, and when you get failure emails after you've done something, the importance of the failure depends on the source. If it's Ehcache 3 and you're a core developer committer, you should have a look at it. If it's Ehcache 3 pull request, wait a bit more for feedback, see if the push request gets closed because of that. So yeah, and maybe a good rule we could have is that if your pull request fails the build, just go add a comment saying, yeah, I know.
Yep.
C, do not merge for review, or just do the equivalent of claiming the build in a classical Jenkins instance.
Yep. I have a question since I went and looked at some things. It was something that I noticed before and forgot to mention. Is there any way we can have it so that it doesn't send 3 mails for every failure? Because at the moment, every element of the matrix build triggers a separate mail.
I can look into it. I think I'll need.
I guess if one of them fails, or maybe two, if 1 out of the 3 or 2 out of the 3 fail, but the other one passes,
so what you want?
If all 3 fail, it seems like. Basically, I want to see if it fails and it's failing uniquely on JDK 1.7. I want to know it failed on 1.7. But if it's failing uniformly across the board on all JDKs, then I don't need 3 mails. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I need to have a look. So
okay.
I need to have a look because
I don't know. It might be not possible.
The default mail plugin does not seem to allow that.
Okay.
But
it's fine. It's not a big deal. It's just like it seems to multiply. Mails multiply up quite quickly when things fail. Anyway, that's fine. There's also something really weird going on with the HTML in that. It's not formatting right, but in the build history.
So I don't know if I'm the only one, but when I'm connecting to one of the pages of our CloudBees instance, when I see the status of the last builds, the link are not rendered properly.
That's what I was saying.
Sorry?
It's not. It's rendering the. It's
rendering
HTML directly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not rendering the HTML.
Okay, so that's actually I think there is a very good reason for that. So we're using a public CloudBees instance. What the pull request plugin does is it takes some information from GitHub and gives that as the build description. But so you could have pretty much anything there. And so what I'm guessing is that CloudBees, for security reasons, disabled HTML tags in the build descriptions. And that's why it's not rendering properly. You're muted, Chris.
In which case, we may as well have it say issue 25, issue 62, prepare SPI
Yeah, the
test.
problem is I have no options anywhere.
Okay, we don't have that much control. It's fine. It's just a really minor cosmetic thing. You can read it.
You know what? I'm saying that, but maybe I need to double check in the main Jenkins configuration.
I assume you're the only person that has a login on this.
Yes, but the thing works with an account. So if you create a CloudBees account and you're an Ehcache developer, I can give you permissions.
Okay.
If you want them.
I'm not sure if I want that much responsibility. Cool. Does anybody have anything else left to say? We have 20 minutes.
Nothing for me.
No, I was going to say I can't think of anything immediately that springs to mind. Our new Git workflow seems to be working when we don't mess it up, which is good news. One thing I would be really interested, actually I was just thinking just now, would be really good if the pull request job could do, would be to do the sanity checking on the Git state and the state of that Git, of that branch. I.e., that we could make the Jenkins job fail if it hadn't been rebased. I know that it's a transient check anyway because it can fail later on, but if somebody has forgotten, has just created a pull request.
The way it works is it's going to rebuild each time you update the pull request anyway.
Right, but what I'm saying is, so...
Oh yeah, I see what you mean.
If you could...
It was green, but another pull request gets merged and suddenly it's not.
But at least you know if it's not. Yes, it's not perfect that it's green, but at least if somebody forgets to rebase to head,
you'll know from
the build failing. And maybe, and if it's possible, whether we can figure out if it has.
So I think it would be possible. I think it would be possible.
Because you just have to figure out what the Git command is and some scripting and stick it in the Jenkins build.
Yeah. The thing that I'm wondering is, do I really want to have that responsibility there too?
Well, it's one of those things where do you want to? It's also,
you know, even if the branch is currently bad, I think I'd rather have CloudBees just verify that the project
build
is
okay.
and
okay, that makes sense. I was just wondering because I'm trying, but maybe I'm being paranoid about needing to sanity check this stuff, and that as we get used to, as more of us get used to Git, we'll be better at it.
Yeah, I think it's also it's so for others that are listening to us, a number of the developers don't have very much Git experience, and so it's also a learning phase for that.
Yep. And even those of us that have more experience or have been doing it for a few weeks now have still managed to screw up in a variety of different ways. A new way every time.
Yeah.
Cool. Then I'm going to call it here unless anyone has anything else to bring up, and I'll try and get Alex to end our recording so that those of you listening to this on YouTube don't have to look at an empty room with just Alex sitting in it for 15 minutes. Okay. Well, I guess you can leave at your leisure, and I will try and get Alex to stop the recording from working.
I'm just pinging him for that.
Luis, do you need to pass that branch back to me to make changes? I haven't seen Chris' comments yet.
So you can go look at the comments on the pull request itself, and you'll see them. And the easiest for you to get the branch is I sent you a mail that explains how to do it.
Yeah, I could do that.
So yeah.
Let me take a look. I guess I'm
logging
out.
If you need help, ping me. No worry.
Cool.
Okay, and we're done. So Alex is gonna shut it off. See you next week.
Yep.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.